despite the appearances, if you're watching this by video, Audrey and I are roughly the same age, even though she looks like she's much younger. Audrey is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Tenet Healthcare and has done so many interesting things for the last 22 years. We met when we were in law school and have known each other for, I just won't say, because people can listen to it. People will listen to this podcast. Audrey, thank you so much for doing this. It's going to be a real joy to talk to you today.
Thrilled to be here. Great to see you.
So I know a little bit about you, but not everybody else does. You've had this very large job for a company that now is approaching $20 billion in revenue, has 65 hospitals, and you've been with the company for 22 years, which is amazing. I've been with Hughes & Lewis / K&L Gates for 30. And we're rare breeds. I've talked to you before about your parents and grandparents and kind of what influenced you. You've just always been such a humble person. Can you talk a little bit about where that comes from?
Sure. I think trying not to take yourself too seriously, trying to approach life, with a sense of humor, keep things in perspective. I mean, these were things that were guiding principles from my dad, who, was a salesperson for IBM. He sold the big Selectric typewriters in the 60s to all the downtown law firms in Dallas. That's how I first got to know what a law firm was. And I got to type my third grade papers on one of those Selectric typewriters. And so, he always lugged those typewriters around in the heat of the summer, wearing a 3-piece suit and a white shirt. And, I think that kept him pretty humble and priorities in the right place, always trying to focus on family. But even in a job like sales, which was never a job I knew I wanted to do, I think he always gained credibility with those law firms. You know how hard that is, by just giving it to them straight, telling them what the thing could do and what it couldn't do and how much it's going to cost, and not trying to pull any fast ones, but just trying to help solve people's problems. And, in the 60s, that made for a pretty good life in the 60s and 70s, selling those electric typewriters and the big copiers and all the other office products that, IBM focused on. So I just think it's as simple and basic as saying what's on your mind, being straightforward, maintaining objectivity, and trying to act in the best interest of other people and help them solve their problems. There's no more magic to it, I think, than that. My mom was a, stay-at-home mom, but she had kind of a, drapery sewing business that she ran, and her focus was, and really still is, both my parents are still living, I'm very fortunate. If something wasn't right, and she'd be looking at it at night and getting ready to go hang it up in a client's house, and it didn't look right, she did it over at her cost, and she had a little bit of that artistic perfectionist gene. And I think that's really important too. You've got to take responsibility for the work that you're doing. And if it's not right, you just need to backtrack a little bit until it comes out, the way that you want. It's going to be hanging up in someone's den for 20 years, hopefully. And, the work that we do tends to have some legs on it too. And I think just that, artistic approach, or maybe artisan approach is a better word, and just approach and dedication to quality, really important.
That's so interesting. My uncle passed away, David Albert, 93 years old, and so it was the last of my mom's siblings. My mom has passed away, unfortunately, and their mom, my mom's mom, so my grandmother, Lily Albert, sold linens and was very much the same way, kind of a combination of your two parents maybe, because she had to sell. Her husband died at a very early age, but I remember her stressing those very lessons about, this is important, and details are important, and colors and patterns, and that's interesting. And I thought a lot about this week. My uncle was buried yesterday, so it's interesting to hear that perspective. Very, very interesting. Well, that's a clip and save for young lawyers for sure, because we think about selling as telling you what you ought to need as opposed to listening. So how did you get into the law? I mean, what was the thinking there? Why did you become a lawyer? Obviously, your dad knew a lot of lawyers.
Sure. I had that early exposure that I think was really important. I babysat for a family, and he had argued a case in front of the United States Supreme Court. I did not realize how rare that was at that point in time. But, so I'd always had these kind of random exposures. And then the lawyers in my life seemed like people who knew how to solve problems, just sort of back to solving problems and being able to help people solve them. They always seemed to kind of have the knowledge on how to deal with life in general, not just legal topics. And so I thought that would, be a potentially interesting path. But I think truthfully, I do remember when I was 16, I worked at a movie theater right across from Prestonwood Mall in the concessions area. And I remember on my first day of training, we were instructed that we were not to say, "Would you like butter on your popcorn?" Because it is not butter. It is butter flavored topping. And someone asked, not me, why, I think it was my best friend, why can't we just tell them it's butter? That's what we call it. And the answer was because the company's lawyers said that would be lying. And I remember thinking, who are these company lawyers, man? And people sounds like people listen to them and take them very seriously. Little did I know that is not actually the case, but it just seemed, and again, it sort of it struck that truth chord with me that it's not butter. And having made it and melted the coconut oil and put the yellow powder in it, it is nowhere near butter. So maybe we shouldn't tell people it's butter if it's not really butter. So anyhow, that kind of stuck in the back of my mind. And then you throw your traditional lawyer skills of being able to read and kind of write a sentence every now and then. And, the next thing you know, you've been practicing law for 30 years.
It does fly, doesn't it? I mean, can you imagine what our conversation? It is fun. And can you imagine what our conversations were like at, in the halls of Hughes and Luce one summer and talking about what we thought the law was going to be and where it actually has gone. And you've done, I can't wait to get into some of these interesting things you've done, but it's true. Somebody I interviewed a few months ago said the truth shall set you free, and really helping people accept the truth and navigate within the law around, with the truth in mind is really what we're all being asked to do. So did you have any thought that you might get into healthcare? I know it took you 7 or 8 years to find your way to Tenet, but was the thought, hey, this healthcare thing sounds interesting?
No, I never planned it. I started off in corporate securities, and I love doing transactions and public offerings and mergers and acquisitions, and that seemed super fun, and that was the stuff I loved in law school. And back then, the healthcare bar really didn't exist of any great depth in the early 90s when I started practicing law. You had firms based in Houston that would have health law sections that kind of cropped up around the Texas Medical Center. But in Dallas, there wasn't, the health law practice that we have today. And I got a healthcare project as a young lawyer, and I just thought, this is so interesting. I'd been doing, real estate investment trust transaction tax and, buying and selling apartment complexes. And that was a lot of fun. And I'm sure for a lot of people, that gets them up out of the bed in the morning. But for me, the healthcare stuff just seemed so interesting. And it seemed like something that, when you ask people, what's the most important thing in your life? They always say my health. And so I thought, wow, I want to do this law thing in that space. And so I actually left my firm to go work with the lawyer I had met during the, kind of summer recruiting process that I had admired, but she was working in a small healthcare company. And so I did, I think my parents thought I was nuts to leave the safety of the giant law firm and, go work for this 200 employee company run by some guy they didn't know. They were a little squeamish about it, but I knew I had to get my legs in healthcare. I had to learn. And I just had a sense that I could learn from her and that she'd be a great mentor. And it was truly probably the best professional decision I made because she taught me how to do it. I loved it. And then that positioned me. I did that for 3 years and then ultimately positioned me to join Tenet in 1998.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I know we can't really wrap our heads around the fact that we're old enough to talk about being trailblazers, but you actually are a trailblazer. I mean, you've been listed top 25 women in healthcare, and, you've gotten all these great awards. Is there somebody, a public figure who you kind of feel like you stand on the shoulders of, that you looked at and said, boy, if I can ever get into a position where I can influence other people, I want to be like her?
Sure. A lot of incredible colleagues that have come before me, both in the healthcare sector and outside of it. My aunt was a high school counselor, and she probably, professionally, I think this sounds terrible. What I'm about to say is not meant terrible, but I probably started drawing on her technique. She would always talk about, with high school kids, she'd just kind of look them in the eye and say, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Just very basic, straight talk. And being able to have conversations with people around difficult topics and have it not be weird is incredibly important thing to be able to do, to be able to deflate the tension in the room. When other people are, whipping up into a frenzy, you bring calm. When things are confusing, you bring clarity. So, I got some of that from my aunt, on the other end of the spectrum. I think Michelle Obama is so famous for her quote, when they go low, we go high. And, irrespective of politics, I think a lot of times the lawyer can be the voice of reason, the voice of clarity, the voice in the room that helps a group move forward. And people that do that, there are so many, are the ones that, I tend to really admire and look to and try and pattern myself after. I've had phenomenal mentors in my law firm life. You were one of those, Craig. I was there when you were a first-year associate, and here we are still today. I think every lawyer I had the opportunity to work with, I learned a little something from. The head of my section, when I first started working as a first-year attorney, he really taught me just how to relentlessly go after a project. No stone unturned, no issue unchecked, protect the flank, think around the corner, look around the corner, all those really good things that kind of separate good from great, and just being able ultimately to deliver a result to a client, even when it's hard and there are a lot of barriers in the way. So that was incredible training. The CEOs I've worked with at Tenet, I've worked with two CEOs directly in this role as general counsel. They have both very different leadership and skill styles, and I've learned a ton from both of them. So I've been so fortunate to have all these different, perspectives.
Yeah, and you're a sponge. I mean, I love the concept that, you've got to find a path where you don't get all excited. You don't raise to the level of the people who are constantly thinking about the outcome. You focus on the task that's in front of you. And I know you've done that. The most notable example, I suspect, is the corporate integrity agreement that you were such a big part of with Tenet. I mean, Tenet had an existential threat to its organization, and you were put in charge of running that process, negotiating with the federal government, dealing with the investigation. Can you give people a little bit of background on that? What the stakes were and what was involved, and then I'll probably ask you some follow-up questions on that.
Yeah, I think at a high level in the healthcare space, I mean, it's one of the most sacred responsibilities that we have, because the most significant customer of any healthcare provider, we own hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers and different providers like that all across the healthcare continuum. The most significant customer that you have is the federal government, and that means the American taxpayer through the Medicare and Medicaid programs. While we certainly serve, patients insured by United and Cigna and Aetna, when you look at each individual payer, the single largest one is the American taxpayer. And so the entire system is based on trust. There is an extensive amount of regulatory structure that we're responsible for navigating. When you're a patient, you want that, right? You want that there to be a lot of specific things that need to be adhered to because you are dealing with that most important thing in your life. It makes being a lawyer in a heavily regulated industry like healthcare, financial services is no different, both fun and challenging at the same time. But in the end, when the taxpayer is your biggest customer, they've got to really trust you to just get it right on your own. And so healthcare companies, Tenet, it is not an atypical thing to have a situation where there was a problem and an issue with one of those regulatory requirements. And so one of the things that the government will do is they will enter into some type of agreement with the company as part of a resolution of one of those issues, make sure that trust is restored and the government takes a more transparent view into the day-to-day operations of the company to make sure everything's going well. Because if you've had a problem, then part of restoring that trust is to provide that transparency. And so there's a lot of, complexity and things you got to do. But I think the thing that I've learned in working with Howard Hacker, our chief compliance officer, who's a phenomenal colleague, is that we just need to operate our business in a way that addresses that basic principle of trust. And when you do that, and you aim higher than the kind of very rigorous and onerous requirements of some of these agreements that the government enters into with you, then you're on strong footing. So we always approach them as we need to satisfy ourselves and our patients and our stakeholders, our physicians, our employees, all the different stakeholders that we deal with. And if we meet those high standards on our own and we're very transparent and straightforward and objective in how we deal with the taxpayer who pays for a lot of the services that we provide, then the specifics and the details and the legal complexity, is secondary. Sometimes you see in other sectors, companies kind of use the law as a weapon or a shield. And in healthcare, it's very different. The law is important, and we have a job to give advice to our clients on what the law requires. But so many times the questions of what should we do, not what can we do, that's the legal question, but what should we do kind of falls back to that trust concept, with the taxpayer, and the taxpayer not being able to kind of, see into the whole process and oversee the decisions that are getting made when they're not in the room. So it's odd because it kind of oversimplifies the work that we do, but it is often the deciding point or the tipping point on a decision about what's the right thing to do here. What, if we were reading it in the newspaper, it sounds trite, but if it was on the front page of the newspaper, how would it look tomorrow?
And you're being so modest about it because a lot of companies, their approach is, you can't accuse me of that, or we're doing everything right. It's a very defensive posture. And really what you're articulating, such an important point is that there's a way to navigate these difficult situations where you try to put yourself in the shoes of what most people would consider your adversary and not think of them as an adversary. You and I both, had the honor of knowing Vester Hughes, who I remember, and you probably remember this, he would always say, the number one lesson of being a great lawyer is treating your opponent with goodwill. And it sounds like that lesson was executed in a way that really allowed Tenet to be the company that it is today. That's a great story. Talk a little bit about, I know at this point you're probably not on every project day to day with outside counsel with all that is involved in being the general counsel of Tenet, but talk a little bit about when you are involved day to day with general counsel, or when you have been, what are some attributes that you look for in general counsel that you value?
Great question. So I actually am involved a lot. And I love, getting the opportunity to work directly with other lawyers on my team. We've got about 50 lawyers at Tenet, and they are phenomenal internal lawyers. We work very closely with our external law firm partners as well. And so a lot of the things that I enjoy the most are making sure that, in fact, the call I did right before this is making sure that we are keeping the overarching goal of what we're doing and why we're doing it top of mind. Because a lot of the work that we do with internal and external counsel, there are different sectors of the healthcare space where we might be, crossing over 3 different internal tenant lawyers, and we have external counsel, and keeping the entire roadmap in front of us, at 100,000 feet, so we don't get lost in the process. I think one of the changes that has happened so much over our careers is complexity. I feel like the law has gotten more and more complex every year, whether it's Sarbanes-Oxley or all the new regulatory things that seem to come after every, Wall Street, front page of the Journal scandal. There's always regulatory reform, and, it tends to layer. They don't tend to take a lot of stuff away. And so that trend in law has driven an excessive amount of complexity. And we are trying to function at the same time as we're working on a project at multiple levels. We're trying to do the right thing the right way for the right reasons for the client. We are also always thinking about potential litigation. So in addition, Tenet's a large company, and the reality of that is we get sued. That's part of, there are many benefits to being a large company. That's not one of them. It is for you. And so finding and thinking with outside counsel, how do we begin with the end in mind? If it's a significant project of complexity, we think about how can we do this from step one so that when it lands in Craig's desk to defend us in litigation, if that's a potential, have we thought through all the issues on the front end? If we have a major matter that we're working on and we know we're going to have a public disclosure in our quarterly filings, let's bring in the right external and internal counsel to make sure that that disclosure is exactly right for our investors, so that we progress that matter appropriately. And the part I enjoy the most is partnering with our external counsel that like to think beyond the thing I do. If I'm a regulatory lawyer, I like regulatory lawyers that can think like litigators. I like litigators that can think like regulatory lawyers, because unfortunately, those are just 2 examples, but all of these things have to be managed through the life of a matter. And to me, that's the fun part. That's the thinking about today before we start. What is the very best way we can deal with this issue, do this transaction, do this internal investigation, whatever the issue is, so that in the end there isn't litigation, or if there is, we're well positioned to defend it and, to achieve the result that the company is trying to accomplish, and to bring our business clients along in that process. External lawyers that can help convey that to our business people in a way that they can not only understand, but also take action on. A lot of times I find that the business folks will go, okay, great. What do we do? And if they're asking at the end of a call with our internal or external counsel, okay, that's lovely. What do we do? Then we've missed something, because we need to be giving advice that's actionable. That's what clients want. Is like, do we do anything? Do we do nothing? If we do stuff, what's the stuff we do? They're kind of interested in our analysis, not as much as we think they are, just saying. But those that can really translate advice into actionable advice that resonates to them, as opposed to the way, kind of lawyers would talk to each other.
It's the Stephen Covey, right? It's that begin with the end in mind. It's Michael Tiger taught that, in trial at UT Law, start with your closing argument and work backwards, because it'll instruct behavior that might keep you out of court, and I think it's missing a lot among lawyers who, as lawyers have gotten so specialized. I mean, this applies to all businesses, but, they think, well, people want specialization. Well, they do, but they want specialization with a big picture command. It's such an important point, and certainly won't be lost on people listening to this. So we're in the middle of COVID. Looks like we're in phase 2. Tenet has been a recipient of CARES Act money. You guys are on the front lines of really what's going on with COVID. Can you talk a little bit about, if you can break it into phases, what Tenet has experienced in being on the front lines in healthcare during COVID and how it's kind of had to adjust to respond to it?
I think we're probably no different than anyone else in terms of, being faced with the situation for which none of us have a playbook. And, those are really interesting times. I think one of the things that I've been proudest of, and I know my colleagues have, is how we've responded. And it's, again, so cliche, but it's times like this where the cream really rises to the top and you really see what people can do, how they respond, how they can, kind of design processes and things that work in the middle, fixing the plane while it's flying through the air, so to speak. Those are some pretty high level skills. And this is where, when you have an experienced team already, that becomes very obvious very, very quickly. And it's been, truly an incredible process to watch, particularly the colleagues in the clinical side of Tenet, manage it. I mean, they have really put together, they do daily calls, we track data at a centralized level. We can kind of flex supplies through different parts of the company. It's been fascinating, just sad, horrible, but at the same time, fascinating to watch COVID move throughout Tenet because we have a national footprint. And so you can very much see, when you see on the news, hotspots are standing up and then they kind of subside. We see that in real time. And I think part of the most heartwarming of it, working in healthcare, I mean, everyone has always held nurses in such high regard, but how the country has just acknowledged nurses, physicians, the caregivers who are putting their lives at risk in an intense amount of uncertainty. That has been just incredibly heartwarming. And, we think about in the law department, those are the people we go to work for every day. We may not always talk to them. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we get to talk directly to them, and those are good days. But that is why we work in-house in a healthcare company. It's been an incredible professional responsibility and honor to just be in a position to digest all the tremendous grant relief that we've received from the federal government, the advanced payment relief. It really is like nothing I've seen in my career. It's just unprecedented how quickly the government got the relief out. And then at the same time, do our jobs as lawyers to identify, what are the terms and conditions we've got to meet in order to accept these funds? How are we going to do that? How are we going to demonstrate that? The type of funds flow that you're dealing with is going to get audited down the road. The government's been very clear, in that. And so how do you do it? Again, begin with the end in mind. How do you set it up on the front end so that it withstands the very appropriate scrutiny that, is likely going to come down the road? And then just doing the government relations outreach and support. We have certainly, members of our management team have done more calls to members of Congress than, in my entire Tenet career combined, because they want our input. Are the relief funds getting to the right places and for the right things? Are the daily updates that come from the federal government on how to use them and what to do with them, in the right zone? They want that input because they know it happened very quickly, and they want to make sure that it is, targeted at the areas, that truly need it. And at the same time, we've gotten a tremendous amount of regulatory relief. In the early days of the pandemic, every regulation I spent my last 22 years giving advice on how to follow was pretty much suspended in some way or another. And so we had to think as a company, when you think about a large company, got over 100,000 1,000 employees, we don't want to just go, okay, go for it. Because we know that's not the right approach. You need to have some process to make sure that we were appropriately accessing the relief we were given and in the spirit in which it was intended. You can't just say, okay, all bets are off, do whatever you need. We will do whatever we need to take care of patients, and we got the relief to do it, but we need to, kind of document what we did and why we did it, because we just don't ever want it to appear that we did it, for wrong reason, that we did it in the spirit in which it was intended so that you could be nimble and flexible. And, that's the stuff at the federal level, at the state level, operating in, all the states. As we saw here in Texas, the executive orders change, and when you're looking at every state in terms of, are elective procedures appropriate? How are they defined? When can they be done? What are the protocols? In one state requires testing, another state wants screening, digesting and getting all that. I mean, it was every one of our, 50 plus lawyers and then some to just get the guidance out to the field in a way that it was actionable. So it was really fun. We learned a ton from, March, April, May. We learned a ton during the clinical spikes, through our clinical colleagues. And I think as we, head into the back part of the year where, we're already starting to see some spikes, we're much better prepared for that at all levels than I think we were in the spring.
Well, and Tenet's in pretty good hands. I mean, it's the same philosophy that you used back in 2006, right? I mean, it's the taxpayers' money. We have to treat it with care. Let me ask you one question on COVID, and this is more put your law profession hat on. Is there something that where you think we've changed as lawyers or professionals supporting companies that maybe we should have changed without needing to change through COVID, but we certainly won't go back to that? Like, what do you see as the sharpen the knife through COVID story?
No, I think there's a lot of great opportunities. I think, just the general process of taking a fresh look at everything we do and why we do it, COVID forced that. And I think we know on a lot of fronts, there will be things we won't go back to. And so, not waiting for the next pandemic, so to speak, to, self-disrupt, take a fresh look at our kind of tried and true ways of doing things. I think that's incredibly healthy. I think some of the things that we're trying to capture, for the longer term are just some of the abilities to do mediation, arbitration, depo, those types of things over Zoom. You save the cost and you save the disruption. And when we think about, as lawyers, I look back to the pre-pandemic times. I mean, it's pretty helter-skelter. And you're hopping on a plane, what felt like every 5 minutes, going to meetings. As a profession, I think we had kind of tapped out on the red of how many things you could cover and how many countries or cities through how many methods. And, I think just the pause button on some of that and the forced reassessment of how much of that is actually driving value. And some of it does. I mean, there are live meetings that, we're not doing right now or that we can't do right now where I think value would be created. Disputes could be resolved sooner. Transactions could be struck easier. But I think those are pretty few and far between. And when you think about now, if you're going to get on a plane to go somewhere for a meeting, I think a lot of folks are doing that kind of risk assessment and saying, is it worth it? What is the additional value I derive for my client by being there in person and being very deliberate about that? Because there's a bit of a safety question now, as there should be. I think that kind of, what is the cost of this plane ticket, hotel room, going to deliver to the client over being able to do it in a more cost-effective way is the kind of assessment we need to continue to do. And I think just for the health of lawyers, it had become a bit of an arms race. How many cities can you go to? How many things can you juggle? Flying from PTA to, your next whatever. And, there's always going to be some of that in the legal profession. We're type A, hard driving, hard charging, only slightly annoying individuals. And so that will creep back. But trying to think of it, how much of that was just vibrating versus creating an outcome, that matters.
Yeah. No, well said. We've got to deconstruct this stuff. And those are certainly some areas that we've had to change and think about differently by necessity. American Airlines was very pleased to see me when I went back to Dallas for a couple of days. It's, I think they would like us to get back to flying a little more, but
they would. My friends in the airline business would not enjoy the comments that I just made.
Yeah. That's okay. They understand. So I've got a couple of what I'd call exit questions. Now no offense to Jerry, but we're gonna put now Audrey Teagarden in 2020, not Audrey Andrews. You're a brand new lawyer. What is the advice that Audrey Andrews gives to Audrey Teagarden about starting her career?
Boy, that's a great question. So I think starting at a great firm, great foundation, there's no way to skip that part. There's no substitute for it. We at Tenet focus on, and probably annoying to our law firm colleagues, but people that got that foundation in a law firm. So I still think that is essential, even in a, Silicon Valley driven kind of era. I think it's critical because you've got to be able to do the basics of analysis in the area that you want to focus on, and you've got to be exposed to people that have high levels of expertise. And that's just the best place to get it. And many of those lawyers will go on and be partners at those firms and become those highly expert lawyers. And some will go run a Silicon Valley company or go in-house. But I think that's still critically important just to get that intellectual muscle where it needs to be, because it really shows in lawyers when they get deeper into practice. I think the more practical piece of it is when you're a young lawyer, you're thinking so much about, when a client has a question or a problem they want to solve, you're thinking so much about, okay, well, here's the problem. What are the cases tell me, or the rules or statute or regs or whatever, what's my legal standard, the old law school, IRAC theory of, legal writing, which kind of turns into a way of legal thinking, applying that, and then, sort of drawing a conclusion. And that's an important analytical construct for lawyers to have. But one of the things that I have found, particularly working in-house, is that none of your business clients think that way. And so they think in a much more practical approach. And one of the things that I have found as a lawyer is oftentimes the solution to the problem is not necessarily found by applying the facts as I know them to the law. That's important. We got to do it. It's part of the job. But oftentimes the solution to the problem, the client's problem, is found in just the facts and having a very in-depth understanding. So things where maybe you get a question from a client and they say, I want to understand how this thing works or legally, or is this an acceptable legal way to do something? And a lot of times the facts that they give you are only, they put a little microscope on one part of the universe. But when you expand that microscope out and you go get more context, you do a little bit of research about, well, what is the medical device they're interested in? And, Google is great for this, and you expand the lens to a fact base that is broader than the one that they gave you. About 60% of the time, the answer to their question, the legal issue, can be completely sidestepped, avoided, because there's a fact out there but they didn't appreciate that it was relevant to them. And so I think time spent really digging in. I mean, you know this, Craig, as a litigator. So often, your cases probably are not won because of, what, law X says or does not say, and whether a judge agrees with your awesome presentation of what law X does or does not say. But they are often won because maybe someone asked a question about this narrow set of facts when they first called you, but when you did your investigation, you found a whole other universe of information, context, background, what happened before the dispute arose, what's going to happen next, what alternatives do we have instead of either or construct that people tend to come to lawyers with. Is this legal or illegal? Can I do this or that? Oftentimes this or that, legal or illegal, is actually 100 things rather than 2 things. And we have to know the law. It's critically important to giving the advice, but the facts are often what get your client to where they want to go if there's a viable solution out there.
Yeah, we get trained with the ability to nuance, and we've got to have enough command of business so that we can read things and understand them and translate them so that we can effectively nuance the situation. It's such a brilliant concept. It's exactly right. Well, you and I've got one last question for you, because you and I, we have a very important engagement after this that we have to get to.
We do.
And so even though it's going to be virtual, it's still going to be fun. I know you're a reader. And when I say your nightstand, that could be the last year or 2. Is there a book that you've read that really stuck with you in the recent past that you'd like to share with others?
So I made a deal with myself in COVID. I was going to read only for fun. And so because I just felt like I read what comes out of the government printing presses every day, and they have been whirring at full tilt. So the book I'm reading now is Where the Crawdads Sing. And I'm reading it because my son read it. He's a senior in high school. I have twins. He read it for English. He loved it, and he's been talking about it. And I feel very behind and at a disadvantage not having read this book that I think everyone else on planet Earth has read. So I'm reading that. And then I just read The Outsider by Stephen King, which is super creepy. Very good read. I hadn't read a Stephen King book, in probably 20 years. So that was a lot of fun. And I'm rolling them back to back at this point just to have a little bit of a mental cleanse from the heftiness of my other reading pursuits prior to this.
Well, Dawn has been trying to get me to read Where the Crawdads Sing, and I've got it. It's on my to-do list, but I'm one of those few people who haven't read it, but I plan to. And The Outsider's perfect for Halloween. Have you seen Jason Bateman? There's a mini series they did around it. Did you see it?
That is up next in the bank. I had to finish first because I didn't want to watch it until I finished the book, and I just finished the book about 2 weeks ago. And so we'll roll it probably this weekend for Halloween for fun. And Where the Crawdads Sing is beautifully written. It reminds me of my favorite book of all time, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. It has a lot of gorgeousness in language that just makes you want to go back and reread the page again, and it's just super fun read for that reason too. So you'll enjoy it.
And I loved that. I'm sure you got to Broadway to see Aaron Sorkin's version with Jeff Daniels, and I just thought, that fast-paced Aaron Sorkin style. I don't know if you ever saw The Newsroom on HBO, but that clip is going around from. Yeah, you saw it. Yeah. So that clip, yes. And I forgot about it, but it's so interesting, where Jeff Daniels is asked, why do you love this country, or why are you so proud of it, or whatever it is. And he kind of responds. We'll let the listener find the Jeff Daniels Newsroom from the first episode. But yeah, I'm with you, and I love reading those beautiful books. I look forward to keeping in touch on this, and maybe we'll do a part 2 one of these days.
That sounds great. Thanks, Greg, for having me. It was a lot of fun.